In today's video, we're going to be talking about the Rakdos Midrange / Rakdos Reanimator deck in Standard, and I'm talking about both in the same video because they are very, very similar with only a few differences, and I don't think it's fair to make people sit through two separate videos when both decks have a very similar core. So if you guys are curious about this deck and want to learn more, go ahead and stick around. We're going to jump into the video. Thank you so much everybody for checking out the video. If you do enjoy the content here, please hit the like button and subscribe. Consider clicking the bell icon if you want to stay notified with all the up-to-date content when it comes out, but I can understand if you don't. Either way, I'm glad to have you here, and if you're new to the channel, we have been doing the Standard series, talking about my journey into Standard, trying to learn it, pass on what I've gathered to maybe some other new players. These videos are not intended to be like source guides for professionals. They're more intended to be like just introductory level to basic deck concepts, and of course I encourage you to not only play on your own and build things and see what works, but also consult, whatever resources you can. Now, if you are new to Magic or just not familiar with terminology, Rakdos is the black-red color combination, and it is definitely one of the strongest decks in Standard right now, especially with a couple different variants. Now, Rakdos Midrange is pretty much the most common up until March of the Machine. I think we could definitely see some changes in the deck, but there really hasn't been enough data out yet with March of the Machine to see like what changes people are going to be making, and I'm sure there will be plenty of updates to these videos for me to make in the coming weeks, but we're going to just use based on like everything up to March of the Machine at this point because I think it's a better pool and will at least give you an idea of where to start. So, the deck is pretty diverse in terms of what it actually plays, with it being very land heavy, especially compared to some other builds. But we're going to jump into creatures first as we start to take a look at the Rakdos Midrange / Rakdos Reanimator decks. Now, one of the core components between both decks, of course, is Blood Tithe Harvester. This is 1 black, 1 red, and it says when this card enters the battlefield, create a blood token. Then you can tap and sacrifice Blood Tithe Harvester. Target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of blood tokens you control. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is a really good card that is easy to put out turn 2. It gives you the blood token, which not only gives you the ability to filter your hand if needed, and I'll talk about why that's important in a moment, but it also gives you the ability to out some problem cards, and that is definitely not something to be overstated. Now, we've also got Atsushi the Blazing Sky. This shows up in a good portion of decks, although not all. This is 2 and 2 red, and it is a legendary creature dragon with flying and trample. When it dies, you can exile the top 2 cards of your library. Till the end of your next turn, you may play those cards or create 3 treasure tokens. Not super hard to summon, a decent powerhouse, and it does give you resources as well as the option of extra mana if you should need it, so it's a good card to consider when building your deck. Now, it is a deck that includes black, so Shoulder the Apocalypse is basically a given. We've talked about Shoulder on the channel before, so I won't go into details crazily, but again, 2 and 2 black, Death Touch. Whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life. Whenever your opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. If you've played any games of Standard, you've probably seen Shouldered around. It is an extremely powerful card and is very expensive for that reason, but if you have it and have access to it, it's definitely going to be good in the deck. You can obviously play around with the numbers and kind of see what you think is best, but it is a really good card. Now, the other options that you have here are Graveyard Trespasser, which is 2 and a black, and it has ward, discard a card, so in order for your opponent to target it, they have to discard a card, which is nice. It is a 3/3, and it says whenever Graveyard Trespasser enters the battlefield or attacks, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. If a creature is exiled this way, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. So, not bad. Extra life gain, kind of like clawing away at the opponent, no pun intended, while also just being a decent-sized beat stick that can remove some problematic stuff, and it does transform with Daybound / Nightbound. Its transformation into Graveyard Glutton is also a 4/4. It has ward, discard a card, and whenever Graveyard Glutton enters the battlefield or attacks, you exile up to 2 target cards from graveyards, and each creature card exiled this way gives an opponent 1 loss of life and you 1 gain of life. Again, it's just a really solid card in Standard for black, and it is definitely one that sees play in a lot of different variants, something to consider in the deck. And that's pretty much it for creatures in this deck, but we're going to talk briefly about another one. If you're playing the Rakdos Reanimator deck, you're typically not going to play Graveyard Trespasser and will instead play Atraxa Grand Unifier. Now, Atraxa is a really, really cool card with a very steep cost. It is 3 and then 1 green, 1 white, 1 blue, 1 black, but understandably so. It has Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, and Lifelink, and with ETBs, you reveal the top 10 cards of your deck, and for each card type, you can put a card in your hand. So the resources this can generate are absolutely absolutely insane. Now, in the Reanimator deck, as the name suggests, you're not typically going to be bringing this out just by hard casting it, although you do have the option of playing a few extra lands and or triomes, at least currently, to have the, rare chance to hard cast it if need be. But we'll talk in a bit when we get to the enchantments how you're typically going to be bringing this card out. I just wanted to mention it because obviously, if you are playing the Reanimator strategy, Atraxa is the core component of that. Now, moving on to Planeswalkers, data shows that not a lot of decks are actually electing to play too many Planeswalkers right now. However, the only one that does show up in some builds is Liliana of the Veil. Obviously, a really, really good card, and her +1 discard effect allows you to get Atraxa Engrave. So if you're playing the Reanimator version of the deck, it's definitely good to consider Liliana. She's pretty solid as a card overall. I just think that the Rakdos Midrange doesn't typically need it in the main board and will instead elect to, make more use of the space that they have. So that's going to bring us to instants and sorceries. Now, again, these numbers do vary a bit, but even between the mid-range and Reanimator decks, it's pretty much right around 10. One of the most common ones, of course, is Cut Down. This is just 1 black and says destroy target creature with total power and toughness 5 or less. Early game, this is extremely useful to be able to out-problem cards, and even in mirror matches to get rid of the opposing Blood Tithe Harvester, or whatever other creatures the opponent might be bringing out. Annex Sentry is another one that sees a good amount of play in Standard and can be outed with this. So Cut Down is pretty good. You've got Duress, which you may know, it's been reprinted many times and has come in and out of the format, but of course, looking at the opponent's hand, choosing a non-creature, non-land card from it and getting rid of it is always good. It not only gives you knowledge of what the opponent has, but it allows you to get rid of problem cards early, so Duress is definitely a card that you'll want to look at. Go for the Throat is another destruction that is 1 and a black, and it's an instant that says destroy target non-artifact creature. While some of Standard's solid cards are artifacts, the majority of them are not, so you do have a pretty good chance of being able to out some of the bigger problems here with Go for the Throat. We've also got a Braid, which is one that does see play commonly, and this is 1 and a red, and it says choose 1. A Braid deals 3 damage to target creature or destroy target artifact. So it does cost the same as Lightning Strike, which can deal 3 damage to any target, but you also have the option of getting rid of an artifact that you wouldn't have otherwise. It's definitely not a bad card to consider either for the main board or the sideboard if you play in a meta where there's a lot of artifacts or things you need to be able to remove. So a Braid is definitely a good card to keep in mind. And finally, Brotherhood's End is a really solid pseudo board wipe. Obviously, it's not going to take out everything, but it's 1 and 2 red, and it says choose 1. Brotherhood's End deals 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, or destroy all artifacts with mana value 3 or less. That second effect is good. It won't come into play a ton, but if you're playing against decks that are making a lot of treasure tokens, or just playing some lower cost artifacts for whatever reason, whether that's blood tokens, or once the incubator stuff starts to come out, I think the incubation tokens might be considered artifacts while they're incubations, but I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to look at that a little bit more in detail. Like I said, we're talking about like kind of pre-March of the Machines up to this point because I think the foundation is important to establish. But Brotherhood's End is a really good board wipe, and Standard doesn't exactly have a lot of board wipes, so this can do a lot of damage for a relatively low cost, all things considered. Now, for artifacts, really the only one that sees any type of consistent play in this deck is Reckoner Bankbuster. It is pretty much a standard mainstay in a lot of decks right now, although some people have said it is a bit slow for the current format as new cards start to get introduced, power levels start to shift, and it just doesn't necessarily do as much as it once did. But I do think it's a good card, and it's definitely worth mentioning. If you're looking to build a more budget version of the deck, you certainly have the option to consider Reckoner Bankbuster as an option. It is just a really solid draw engine that does give you access to good things. I would say it's more likely going to see play in the regular mid-range version of the deck versus the Reanimator strategy, but some people may overlap those a bit too, so you just kind of have to figure out what works best for you and what you're most comfortable with. Now, enchantments is definitely one of the key components of this deck. You have only 8 of them in total, that being Fable of the Mirror Breaker. You're playing 4 copies of this, pretty typically in most builds. This card is very, very good in Standard, and it's still with us until September when it will be rotated out. Of course, create the Goblin Shaman token, discard and draw, and then you can exile it to make Kiki-Jiki. Kiki-Jiki can create copies of your other creatures, so like you can copy Blood Tithe Harvester, make extra tokens, and then sack the copy because it has haste, and it's just a really, really neat synergy. And it's even better in the Reanimator version because you can use it to discard Atraxa, and that's just, another way you have to kind of get there, getting to your endgame strategy faster. And then we've got the Cruelty of Gix. Now, this card is really, really good and pretty much the only main Reanimator that I'm aware of in Standard at this time. 4 black, and that is 3 and 2 black, and it's got a couple decent effects. Target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a creature or planeswalker from it, they discard that card. So it's like a Thoughtseize-esque, at least in terms of being able to get rid of creatures. The second one says search your library for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle, you lose 3 life. So like Demonic Tutor adjacent, you know, more balanced for standard. And then the third effect says put a card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So of course the objective of the Reanimator strategy is getting Atraxa in grave and then using Cruelty of Gix to put it back for free, bypassing its cost and getting the benefits of it with the, you know, plus 10 potential search top of the deck, look for whatever cards you want. It just gives you a crazy amount of resources, and you can kind of loop this card, you can utilize it more than once. It's just a really, really strong card for the deck, and it's basically the way you get Atraxa out quick. But even the mid-range versions of the deck that aren't playing Atraxa are still playing this card in some capacity. Sometimes, because you are able to use it to bring back things like Sheoldred, it's just not as common, and typically you can dedicate the space to other things. So again, I'll say, look on websites like MTG Goldfish, Scryfall, all over the place. I mean, there's so many different good resources for example deck profiles, and you can kind of find what other people are doing and test and see what works for you. Finally, moving on to lands, there are a lot of them, and I will not burden you with all of them, but we'll just touch on a few examples. Basically, you want to utilize as many dual lands you can that are standard legal that will get you your color combinations. Typically, black and red, if you're playing mid-range, is going to be sufficient. So you've got cards like Blackcleave Cliffs, which comes in tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands, so it's definitely a good early game card. You have Haunted Ridge, which says unless you control 2 or more other lands, it enters tapped, so a bit better of a later game card. And then things like Sulphurous Springs, of course, the Pain Land. Those are all pretty standard for, you know, a black-red deck, and, you know, they give you easier mana fixing. Plaza of Heroes is a really solid card as well, especially because it can give you indestructible and hexproof for your legendary creatures, while also giving you some, you know, extra color diversity for your legendary spells, which you do play a decent amount of in this deck. Now, if you are playing the Reanimator strategy, you can definitely include more dual lands just to have access to some other colors. You have, you know, some of the triomes that are still legal. You have cards like Sundown Pass, Dark Slick Shores. Really just kind of, you know, depends on whether or not you're choosing to tech a few things in there that fall outside your normal color patterns, or if you just want to be able to make Atraxa hard casting it from the hand. But generally speaking, that's only for the Reanimator strategy. Otherwise, you're just going to be playing, you know, your typical red-black Grixis lands, and then you could play some basic lands. You can play the channel lands from Kamigawa. There's a, you know, a good variety of them, but you're typically going to want to try to stay within that level of, you know, design for those cards. So that's basically the ins and outs, a very quick, you know, 10 to 12 minute summary of how Rakdos Midrange / Rakdos Reanimator works. I do think these decks will end up changing quite a bit with some of the new cards introduced into the format, and when rotation happens, you'll see them change drastically, but you want to start to game plan for that a little bit if you're getting into the format. You know, what do you want to pick up? What might be rotating out that isn't really necessarily worth the investment? And then obviously you have your cards like Sheoldred that you know aren't going anywhere and are going to be really solid in there. So it'll be interesting to see what this deck looks like as new sets come out and as some of the more, you know, well-known players get a chance to really play test with the color combos. But that's my basic introduction to it. Let me know what you guys think of the deck down below. If you play it and you think there's some important points I didn't touch on, definitely let me know so that other people can see that as well and, you know, get some better guidance for building their own deck. And again, if you did enjoy the video, feel free to subscribe to the channel for more videos. I'll catch you next time. Peace.